There is a story, an old story. I'm not sure if it's a fable or not, but it's a story about the sun and the wind. They decided to have a contest together, see who was more powerful, you know. And so the sun and the wind were talking together, and I'm more powerful, and they're getting into kind of this argument. And down on earth, they see this poor little old lady with a coat on. She's kind of walking along, hunched over. She goes to market. And the wind says, I bet I can blow that coat right off of her. I am so powerful. And the sun said, I'm not sure. I think you're just a lot of hot air, but let's just see what we can do. And so the wind started blowing, and her coat all of a sudden caught the wind and it started billowing out, but she clutched it tighter. And the wind said, you watch, you've seen nothing yet. And he begins to blow harder and harder and harder, and she's clutching her coat tighter and tighter until finally he's coming down with hurricane kinds of gusts, and she's being blown, but the coat remains on her body. Well, Mr. Wind is out of breath. And he goes, whatever, you see what you can do. And the sun says, okay. And the sun just kind of was the sun. Just started warming up. And after about a minute, she took her coat off. And the story illustrates something very, very important. It's a simple kind of children's fable, you might say, but it illustrates something really, really important for us as Christians. And it illustrates an important concept that revolves around what I would say is the most important idea, most important aspect of who Jesus was and who Jesus is to us today. And Jesus did a lot of miracles. He said things that were wise. He taught us. He showed us how to live. But the most important thing in the hearts of the early church, and Paul the Apostle included, and the writers of the gospel, was the cross of Jesus Christ. And I remember years as an Episcopal priest downstate in Davison in the Flint area, we would go through Holy Week, right? And the different days, Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. And we do a Good Friday service here, but it was a little more institutionalized or liturgical in my Episcopal days. And I can remember Pat saying to me, she loved Jesus, she loved the Bible, she lived a life that was exemplary, a lot of love, service, but she came up to me and more than once and said, I can't go to the Good Friday service, sorry. When I was Father Scott in those days. Sorry, Father Scott, I can't go. I'm not into Good Friday. I love Easter, but I'm not into Good Friday. The whole cross thing is too dark, too depressing, just isn't for me. Can't do it. And I'd like to open up for us some aspects of the cross, different ways of viewing the cross of Christ. And the common way that we tend to emphasize is what is called the substitutionary atonement model. And it's one of many different ways to look at the cross. The cross is like a diamond, has many different facets to it. We're going to look at some of the other facets maybe you haven't considered. Substitutionary atonement says that Jesus Christ took upon himself all of our sinfulness, all the things we've done wrong, all the things we're going to do wrong, all the things we've done wrong in the past, and all of our darkness. In fact, even more than that, he took upon us, if you read Isaiah 53, he took upon himself all of our brokenness, not just sinfulness, but our physical, mental, emotional brokenness, our hurts, our diseases, everything. He took all of that stuff upon him at the cross into himself. That's his final solution. That's God's final solution for us as human beings. So that we don't have to, if we so choose, We don't have to suffer the ultimate consequences of those. Not just in terms of eternity, but there are benefits for us right now. Because Jesus took all the darkness into him, we can walk in the light, which he's also the light. And so he became our substitute, where our own self-destructiveness, sinfulness, darkness, poor eating habits, blah, 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 all of this stuff that tends to kill us, Jesus took all this killing stuff, all the toxins, everything into himself. And if we choose, we can live a life that is abundantly full, to use Jesus' words, abundantly full. We have that choice. You say, yeah, but you don't know my circumstances, you don't know my finances, you don't know my kids, you don't know my dog, you don't know my wife, my husband, whatever, all these things surrounding us, I can't really live in abundance with all this junk happening around me. How do you live palatially in a junkyard? Well, Jesus says you can, because it's all how you process it here and here. And he gives us the resources to live abundantly wherever we are. And that's because of the cross, that he took all of our junk and gave us back grace. He gave us back life. We gave him death. He gives us life. And that's a perfectly biblical model. What I'd like to do is I'd like to explore some other things that come through the cross for us. Some things that may revolutionize the way that you look at life. And I'm going to say that the cross, if we take the cross of Christ seriously, it's not a concept, it's more than even theology. It's a lens, you might say, a way to look at life. A lens through which we look at life. A lens through which we look at other people, that we look at our finances, that we look at our boss, that we look at our kids, a lens through which we see ourselves, we see the Bible, we see what we believe. Everything passes through the lens of the cross of Jesus Christ. And if we take this seriously, there will be all sorts of kind of affirmations. There'll be a yes. Let me hold this in the correct way. Yes, to things that we never considered possible. God is the God of the impossible, and that is made possible through the cross. All sorts of yeses in our lives. But most likely they'll come as surprises. We tend to want God to answer our own kinds of selfish prayers that are very limited, and God goes off into a whole nother field and answers not just our desires, but he goes deeper to our needs and answers needs. Along the way, though, because a yes is a yes, there will be things outside of that yes, and the cross of Christ also declares to us some no's. Some no's. It's a no to certain belief systems that we have, ways that we view other people, ways that we try to protect ourselves, ways that we try to hold on to life with our white little knuckled hands. And the cross says no to that. It says that that has to die. And we struggle with those things. It's tough. Anybody who admits truthfully that they're trying to work the cross of Christ into their lives, it is tough. It's hard to do that. And so today what I'd like to consider, it's probably best illustrated in, it's a story that came out of a book called The Power of Kindness. The Power of Kindness. And if you're interested in it, I've got it on my Kindle. I can show you the specs on that. But it's a series of stories, and the theme is that kindness, something that we consider not very powerful, kindness is actually an extremely powerful, transforming kind of thing. That if we can live that out in our lives, it can be terribly transforming for people around us. It's catching. Kindness is catching. So The story is about a woman who is living in a rather kind of an economy apartment building. The walls are thin, and she began to notice in the evening that there was a young couple living next to her. She was single. And right next to her bedroom, the couple just had a baby, new little baby, and the baby's room was, of course, right next to her bedroom, this woman's bedroom. And she noticed that the baby was crying a lot, just a lot. And so after a couple of sleepless nights, the woman went next door and knocked on the door of this young couple. And she said, I just noticed your baby's crying a lot. Is there anything that I can do to help? Is the baby colicky, or can we get medicine, or can I help with anything? And the couple said, no. We just, we put the baby down, and then we have our own time. We watch TV and drink margaritas and have a good time because we need it. And that's our time, and the baby cries. Baby just cries itself to sleep. It's fine. She goes, okay. And so she goes back. And a few more nights of this, her anger level is really rising up, and she's thinking about child protective services. She's thinking about telling the couple off and just, really letting them have it. And she's just getting angrier and angrier and angrier. And finally, God speaks to her heart one evening, because she's, of course, awake. And she hears that gentle, still, small voice of Jesus say to her, "Why don't you sing?" She had a beautiful singing voice, and she begins softly to sing to the baby. And she finds that the baby's crying starts to go down more and more each night. And as this becomes kind of a habit, a ritual, you might say, at bedtime, she begins singing, and the baby falls asleep much more quickly each night. The power of kindness. I'd like to talk about power in general. This is, to me, one of the most important lessons of the cross of Jesus Christ. Because what God does on the cross, because remember, Jesus is God, okay? And Jesus is our perfect picture of God the Father. He's a perfect image of the creator of the universe. He's the perfect example of the God who holds the stars in his hands and creates all sorts of cool things. Molecules, atoms, quarks, all sorts of things. And when Jesus goes on the cross, he gives us a picture of God that is so powerful. This is a God whose answer to sin is to become powerless. He doesn't get mad. He doesn't wipe us out. Good. He doesn't torture us. His answer to evil is powerlessness. Seemingly powerless, allows himself to be nailed to a cross. And from that deep, deep powerlessness, at least in our eyes, comes the most powerful solution to our problems that we could ever imagine. A solution that goes so much deeper than Band-Aids or fix-up. It goes right to the heart of the darkness itself. And all that because God was willing to be powerless for us. The Bible, if you look at it in a certain way, it's essentially a struggle between power systems and powerlessness. It's systems of power, whether it be the Roman government or Egyptians, and you can certainly apply that today, or it can be individual people who are trying to exercise power in a way that slams through, I did this, and I was the one who made this happen and all of this. And it's that struggle between that and a surrender, a letting go, going from fists to open hands before God and saying, I can't do this. I trust you. I'll participate, but I'll trust you to lead the way. And that essential giving over to God's power. And the Bible is a struggle. I mean, all the way from, look at 1 Kings 19, that famous story about Elijah the prophet. And he's just done some very, very powerful things. But he's scared and he's hiding away from a powerful, evil regime. And he's up in a cave, and all these powerful images, fire and storm and wind and stuff like this, terribly powerful things pass by Elijah. But God is not in any of them. And finally, God is in what your Bible may translate as a still, small voice. In fact, the Hebrew is very specific. The word is damah. Damah. And damah means more than just a quiet little voice. It actually means stillness or silence. It means where everything ceases. Everything's still. You can hear a pin drop. And God becomes damah for Elijah. All power is gone, seemingly. It's all stillness. There's a psalm where the psalmist says, David, in fact, in this case, says, "For God alone my soul in silence waits. From him comes my salvation." God alone my soul in silence waits. From him comes my salvation. The word silence there is, guess what? Damah, a form of that. My soul, I quiet my soul to hear the quiet whisper of the powerless God who holds the universe in his hands. Elijah struggled with it. On the other end of the Bible, Paul struggles with it also. Paul is the educated rabbi. He's the one who makes things happen. Persecuted the church of God, killed some Christians, tortured a few more. He made things happen. He was the go-getter. He was that strange kind of combination of administration and courage, and he went out, and when he saw something that needed to be done, it got done. And Paul struggled with that. And he struggled with his own kind of inner stuff that was going on and letting go. And you can read about that in Romans chapter 7 and Romans chapter 8 and countless other places. I think especially about 2 Corinthians 12, though, where Paul had a thorn in his flesh. He had some sort of disease or some sort of deal, something that he couldn't get rid of himself. That's the bottom line. We don't know what it was. People speculate, but something he couldn't get rid of on his own. He struggled and he fasted and he prayed to God and oh God, get rid of this thing. I'm so ineffective that I could be so much better at doing my job for you. This is you now we're talking about. And if you would only heal me of this, take it away. And just like with Elijah, God calls in a still small voice. And he says, one of the most powerful things to Paul that I could ever imagine. God says to Paul the apostle, the powerful apostle, he says, "My strength is made perfect in weakness." And he said, "My grace," and grace is just that continual flow from the heart of God. He said, "My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And my grace is sufficient for you." The cross of Christ makes this possible because it gives us a picture of power, the way that God operates. He doesn't operate, and David understood this when he stood before Goliath and he proclaimed that. He said, "You come at me with swords and all sorts of things, but I come to you in the name of the Lord." The name of the Lord. That's it. That's it. Little shepherd boy defeating a regime, a powerful, powerful giant. But that's the way God operates. He takes our concept of power and he turns it upside down. Absolutely. Think about the places where you're striving, where you're trying to make something happen. You're trying to change somebody who's close to you, and it isn't working. Surprise. Or you're trying to change something at work or something at your church, or you're trying to make something happen, and you're trying so hard, and you're so smart, and you're so strategic. I mean, you're really good at this normally, but it's just falling apart. It isn't working. Take a clue from Elijah or Paul or David. That the cross of Christ teaches us some powerful things. The cross of Christ says yes. It says yes to the fact that God is for you. God is for you. Now, this may sound like kindergarten stuff, but most religion doesn't operate that way. You have to curry the favor of a deity. You have to try to get somebody, or I guess in people life, you have to try to get people to like you or go along with you. You have to convince and cajole and twist and do some manipulative things, you feel like, to try to get God or a god or gods to like you. Well, guess what? The truth through the cross is that God is already for you. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, to the end that all that trust in him should not perish, but have what? Everlasting life. It's not just about heaven, folks. It's about life right now. It's about living abundantly right now. Because the word eternal life in the New Testament means life of the ages. To have the life of the ages. The best life you could have, I guess, to quote Joel Osteen. But to have a really great life right now that will carry into an eternity, a party that never ends. All because of the cross. God says, yes, I am for you. I am not against you. But because of that yes, it says no to some of our beliefs, our belief systems, about feeling separated, about feeling that I'm not connected. And that's a common feeling that we have, that we're not connected, we're disjointed, or some days are better than others. But generally speaking, we have to kind of work at kind of remembering, oh yeah, that's right, I am loved, I can give love, that the only one who can break the connection is me. That in terms of God, he makes that connection in our lives automatically. God is love. God is love, and he loves us no matter what, whether we're happy, sad, sinful, not sinful at that moment, whatever we're doing or not doing. And so it says no, the cross says no to some of our ideas about being disconnected. We may feel a certain way, which is fine, but it isn't the reality. Read the last part of Romans chapter 8. Paul goes over and over and over again, reinforcing that nothing will separate you from the love of God in Jesus Christ. Height, depth, angels, principalities, those are evil systems, folks, by the way. Evil governments can't separate you, no matter what they do. Evil systems within families cannot separate you from the love of God. Nothing can separate angels, nothing supernatural or spooky or whatever scare you into. You alone make the decision as to whether you want to feel connected or not. You're still connected. This is the catch-22 maybe of how God operates. God never separates his love from you. You may feel like it, but God is faithful even when we're unfaithful. He doesn't pull off. He doesn't deny his own nature, which is love, which is self-sacrificial, continuous giving of himself to us for our good. So there is a necessary no to all of this. One of the greatest places where Paul is talking to the Corinthian church. And keep in mind, the Corinthians, they're Greek, right? Greek philosophy, remember your world history. I mean, these are really intelligent people, and they know all of the philosophical arguments to this and that and religious arguments. And we're all open, and they're talking with Paul. And Paul in 2 Corinthians, the first chapter, Paul says, you know, this isn't about banter. This isn't about yes and no. He says the word that's contained in God, in Jesus Christ, is always yes. He says that in the first chapter. He says, in fact, all the promises of God for you are yes. And so how can we not live abundantly when we are resourced so amazingly by a God who loves us and gives himself for us over and over and over again? Because it's all in our heads. Because of our belief systems about how we think life operates. And that's all formed and massaged by our experiences, good and bad, mostly bad. Our experiences of hurt and pain and rejection. And so we form our theology based upon that, our view of life, our view of our spouse, our view of our kids, grandkids, of how things ought to work, are all viewed, if we're honest with ourselves, on the nose of our lives. The negative parts of our lives are the voices that are calling this forth, if we're honest with ourselves. And so the cross directs us to a whole new way of looking at life. The powerless God who calls us into a new way of being. He calls us into a way of living that will radically revolutionize not only our lives, but the lives of those around us. Not through coercion, but through compassion. God calls us to a cross-shaped life. Jesus said every day, if you read in Luke, every day we take up our cross. And it's not like, oh, it's so heavy. Because the cross is meant to liberate us from all the things, all the prison stuff that we put on ourselves. The cross is meant to free us up. In the cross of Christ, I glory. Every day. I'd like you to think about places, and I kind of hinted at this before, but think about places where you are trying to impose your will. Now you may say, no, it's God's will. I'm only trying to think of the best for my kid or my spouse or my boss or my relative or my neighbor on the street or my pastor or whatever. No, it's all biblical. This is good stuff, you know. And it may well be. But to think really honestly about how you are trying to move this great truth, great grace into the life of another person or into the lives of a system that you're angry at or discontented with. It's about how you're moving that along. And I'd like to just suggest this morning that you walk away, as you go away from here, to think about those places where you're hitting up against a wall. And I'd like to suggest and invite you to consider a different way. Let's call it the way of the cross. Where number one, you realize that you're not in this alone, because we feel that way, right? But you're not in this alone. There is a God, a friend, a partner, a lover, a being, a father who loves you, puts his arm around you, and is a companion to you in this challenge, whatever you're doing or not doing. And that he is the power, the source that will both guide you and transform you along the way, if you allow him to do that. And I'm not talking about, whether you go to church or whether you're a Christian. I don't really even care, I guess, so much right now what your theology is. Wow, can barely believe I'm saying that. But it really is, it doesn't matter. All your theological concepts and your neatly packed evangelical stuff, it doesn't mean anything unless you trust the God, the powerless God, who will show you a different way, a different perspective. And so Jesus says it's time to take the log out of our own eye to be able to see clearly what's truly going on around us and to stop all the self-justifying stuff. I'm saying this to me too. I preach to myself. I hear you, Lord. But it's a process. It's an ark. It's a boat that we're all in. To be honest enough, courageous enough, surrendering enough to really lay stuff before the Lord, to lay it before the cross, and to let the God who whispers something powerful into your heart today. Are you willing to do that? I mean, really. Religion aside, are you willing to be honest with Jesus today and allow him to show you a new way to exercise power in your lives?